A scribe in Mero presses a reed pen into wet clay, recording his king's war. He is writing in a language your history class told you never existed. Tonight, we hold that claim up against the manuscripts, the inscriptions, and the DNA studies, starting with 3 lies. That's what most of us got handed instead of an actual continent. Myth 1. Africa had no writing system, nothing beyond a few marks scratched onto rock. Myth 2. No African empire ever matched Rome, not in scale, not in wealth, not in reach. Myth 3. The slave trade was the whole story, as if nothing worth naming happened before those ships arrived. Between you and me, I've sat with these 3 lies since I was a kid, flipping past a chapter that skipped an entire continent's golden ages in half a page, and I still feel the weight of what got left out. As historians documented, none of the 3 survive contact with the actual sources. Tonight, we test every one of those lies against something sturdier than opinion: manuscripts, inscriptions, and the DNA studies still being published. We're going kingdom by kingdom, chapter by chapter, for the entire hour. Kush, and a script older than Rome's own alphabet. Axum, minting its own coinage while Italy was still laying its first roads. Mali's library shelves holding tens of thousands of manuscripts that most Western classrooms never mention. Songhai's administrators running a territory larger than Western Europe, and the dry stone walls of Great Zimbabwe still standing after 8 centuries, with no mortar holding a single one of them together. Manuscripts and inscriptions carry more weight than any claim I could make alone. That's something I believe deeply, and it's why we'll let the carved stone and the written record do most of the talking tonight. Most people expect a video like this to end with a highlight reel of kingdoms, and then the credits roll. That's not where tonight lands. Stay with me, because the last discovery tonight does something those textbooks never prepared you for. It reaches into a modern genetics lab, into a study on lineage most people have never heard of, and hands you a line running from a Nubian throne room straight to your own bloodline. I won't spoil it yet. What I believe, and what the evidence keeps showing, is that it only gets stronger as we go, not weaker. And by the final chapter, you'll understand exactly why I keep calling this the discovery that rewrites whose bloodline you're standing in. Picture the map before any European ship ever reached these shores. Along the Nile, Kush controls a kingdom stretching hundreds of miles south of Egypt, with its own capital, its own royal courts, its own army. Across the Red Sea, Axum runs ports linking 3 continents in a single afternoon's sail. Goods moving between Rome, Arabia, and India through a single harbor town. In the Sahel, Mali and later Songhai command gold and salt routes, running from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Sahara. Caravans hundreds of camels long, crossing sand that swallows lesser expeditions whole. These are continent-scale trade networks, moving cloth, copper, salt, gold, ivory, and books across distances most people never picture when they hear the single flattened word, Africa. As historians document it, this isn't one kingdom rising in isolation, while the rest of the continent waits its turn on some imaginary schedule. These are multiple simultaneous kingdoms: Kush, Axum, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, each running its own currency, its own courts, its own written record at the same time. Sometimes trading with each other across thousands of miles of desert and river. Sometimes never meeting at all and still building monuments that would stand for 1,000 years. I've sat with that overlap for a long time because it means the story was never one long empty stretch waiting for history to begin. It means history was already crowded, already busy, already writing itself down, while the map most of us grew up with stayed blank from the Sahara to the Cape. The period accurate scope, as historians document it, runs roughly from 300 BC through 1600 AD. Over 18 centuries where these kingdoms rise, peak, and in some cases outlast the Roman Empire itself by centuries. 18 centuries is not a footnote. It's longer than the distance between us and the fall of Rome, longer than the gap between the printing press and the smartphone in your pocket, long enough for a script to be born, forgotten, and rediscovered by archaeologists, who had no idea what they were looking at when they first found it. That's the map we're about to fill in, kingdom by kingdom, with the evidence each one left behind. Let's name the first lie precisely. Myth 1 says Africa had no writing system before European contact. No letters, no script, no way to record a law or a king's name for later generations to read. That claim doesn't survive 5 minutes, with the actual evidence sitting in museum archives. Meroitic hieroglyphs and cursive script were carved into temple walls in Kush over 2,000 years ago. Ge'ez, the script of Aksum, is still used in church liturgy today, unbroken, generation after generation. Arabic script manuscripts filled private libraries in Timbuktu by the thousands, covering everything from poetry to astronomy. As historians document it, writing wasn't rare on this continent. It was everywhere. On stone, on parchment, on coin, on the walls of buildings still standing. Myth 2 says no African empire ever matched Rome. Not in territory, not in wealth, not in the sheer administrative machinery it takes to run a civilization for centuries without collapsing into chaos. Songhai's territory alone, at its height, stretched further than most of Western Europe combined. Governed through provinces and appointed officials answering to a central court. Mali's gold moved markets from Cairo to Venice, enough of it flooding in at once. That one pilgrimage reportedly depressed gold prices in the region for years afterward. Aksum minted its own gold coinage centuries before most of Europe managed the same trick, stamping kings' faces onto currency that traded as far as India. None of that erases what Rome built. It just means Rome wasn't the only empire on Earth capable of building something that size. Myth 3 is the heaviest one to unwind, because it isn't false so much as it's incomplete. And incomplete claims are the hardest kind to argue with. The slave trade happened. It devastated families, kingdoms, entire coastlines. And no honest account of this continent's history skips past that wound, or pretends it away. But treating it as the whole story, as if nothing else on this continent mattered before or alongside it, as if 15 centuries of kingdoms simply vanish into one paragraph, flattens the record in a way the evidence doesn't support. I don't say that to minimize the trade or what it cost. As many historians frame it, both things are true at once. The wound is real, documented, and generational. And so is everything that came before it and ran alongside it the entire time. So why did these three myths take hold in the first place, when the evidence was sitting there the whole time? As historians document it, a lot of the damage traces back to 19th and 20th century textbook framing, written mostly by European and American scholars who had limited access to sources outside their own languages, and, in some cases, little interest in looking. Most teachers simply assumed the record wasn't there because nobody had handed them a translation. It was there. It just wasn't translated yet. Sitting in libraries most Western scholars never had a reason to visit, and a textbook can't cite a manuscript nobody in the room can read. Most people assume historians had already looked everywhere and found nothing worth including in the record. That's not quite what happened. Limited translation of primary sources into English meant that Arabic script chronicles from Timbuktu, Ge'ez court records from Aksum, and Meroitic inscriptions from Kush sat largely untouched by English language scholarship for generations. Not because they didn't exist, not because they lacked detail, but because almost nobody outside a small circle of specialists could read them fluently enough to translate them properly. Many scholars now argue the gap in the textbook was never really a gap in the evidence. It was a gap in translation. And translation is slow, underfunded work that took most of a century to catch up. Which brings us to method. Because I'm not asking you to take my word for any of this, and you shouldn't just take mine. Manuscript evidence anchors every claim tonight. Legal rulings, court chronicles, personal letters, still sitting in libraries and private family collections across West and East Africa, some of them only catalogued in the last few decades. Inscriptions and archaeology carry the rest of the weight. Carved monuments, coin hoards, City walls excavated stone by stone, each one dated and cataloged by researchers who've spent entire careers on a single site, cross-checking one inscription against another until a timeline holds together. And where the written and the buried run out, we'll bring in a DNA study reference, or two. Genetic research connecting present-day populations to the lineages these kingdoms left behind, published in the kind of peer-reviewed journals that don't print speculation. As historians and geneticists both document it, no single source tells the whole story alone. A manuscript can lie about a king's victories. A monument can be commissioned for propaganda. A genome cannot. Put manuscript, inscription, and genome side by side, and the picture that emerges gets very hard to argue with. Follow the Nile south past Egypt's last temple, past the first cataract where the river turns, rough and rocky, and you reach a kingdom most textbooks mention in a single sentence, if at all. This is Kush, a civilization rising along the Nile Valley in what's now Sudan, with its own capital cities at Kerma, and later Napata and Meroe, its own royal line stretching back centuries, and its own ambitions that had nothing to do with waiting for Egypt's permission to exist. Its people farmed the same fertile riverbanks, fished the same waters, and built their own temples to their own gods long before any pharaoh ever marched south to test them. I remember the first time I traced this stretch of the Nile on an actual map instead of a flattened textbook diagram. How far south Kush's territory ran, how close its cities sat to Egypt's own southern border, and how the river itself seemed to treat both kingdoms as equal neighbors rather than one civilization. And its footnote: Kush wasn't a colony or a curiosity tucked beneath a more famous neighbor to the north. It was Egypt's southern neighbor, and, for long stretches of history, its rival, trading with it when peace held, fighting it when it didn't, and occasionally ruling it outright when the balance of power tipped south instead of north. As historians documented, this wasn't a brief flare-up of ambition that burned out after a generation either. We're talking centuries of parallel civilization, Kushite kings and Egyptian pharaohs occupying the same river valley, sometimes generations apart, sometimes at the very same moment, each building temples in their own name, each recording their own version of events, for their own priests and their own people to remember. Two civilizations, one river, running side by side for the better part of 2,000 years, trading gold and cattle and soldiers back and forth across a border that moved more than either side liked to admit. Somewhere around the 2nd century BC, Kush's scribes stopped writing only in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the script of their powerful northern neighbor, and started writing in their own script entirely, the Meroitic alphabet, built for their own spoken language, carved into their own temple walls, and stamped into their own royal seals. It's a writing system most people have never heard the name of, let alone seen a photograph of. Even though it sat less than 1,000 miles from the pyramids everyone learns about in school by the 3rd grade. Here's the part that still catches me. As historians document it, Meroitic is still only partially deciphered today, nearly 2 centuries after European scholars first laid eyes on it. Researchers can sound out the letters. The alphabet itself was cracked over a century ago, syllable by syllable. But large stretches of what those letters actually mean remain genuinely uncertain, because so few bilingual texts survive to check the translation against, unlike the Rosetta Stone that cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs wide open. I find something almost humbling in that. A civilization can hand us its own words, carved in stone for us to find, and still keep some of its secrets, simply because we never recovered the key. None of that uncertainty erases what's sitting in plain sight, waiting for anyone willing to look. Inscriptions on monuments across the old Kushite heartland, temple walls, funerary stelae, royal palace facades, carry this script by the hundreds, catalogued and photographed, waiting for scholars to finish the job. Earlier generations barely started. A writing system this old, this extensive, this clearly its own invention rather than a copy of someone else's, is rarely taught alongside Egypt's in any classroom I ever sat in. That's the gap we're closing tonight, one inscription at a time. Before we climb from Kush's riverbanks into the pyramids the next chapter is about to show you. Pyramids that, as it turns out, outnumber Egypt's own by a wide margin. Picture the desert east of the Nile at Meroe, sand rippling gold under a sky gone white with heat. And rising out of that sand, not one pyramid, not a dozen, but field after field of them, sharp-angled and small, packed together like a city built for the dead. As historians document it, more pyramids stand at Meroe today than anywhere in Egypt. Roughly 200, counted across the Kushite necropolises, versus the handful of true pyramids Egypt built at its height. Closer to 118 when you count every collapsed and half-buried structure, from Giza down to Dashur. Numbers like that don't fit the picture most of us grew up with, where Egypt is the pyramid civilization, and everyone south of it is an afterthought. Look closer, and the shape itself tells you these builders weren't copying anyone. Kushite pyramids rise at a steeper angle than Egypt's, narrow-based, tall and needle-sharp, more like a spire reaching for heaven than the broad, settled mass of Khufu's tomb at Giza. Archaeologists have found evidence that this steeper style wasn't a mistake or a smaller imitation of Egypt's. It was a deliberate architectural choice, built with a smaller footprint, because the burial chamber sat not inside the pyramid itself, but in a chapel and shaft dug into the ground beneath it, with the stone pyramid standing above as a monument, a marker, a crown over the actual resting place of a king, or a kandek, the Kushite word for a ruling queen. Meroe crowned queens outright, not as a footnote beside their husbands, but in their own right. If I'm being honest, I don't have every answer for why this civilization gets left out of the same textbook page as the Giza Plateau, sitting less than 1,000 miles away. But I can't shake the fact that 200 pyramids is not a small footnote. It's a skyline. My elders told me a version of this story once, in passing, more rumor than record. Years later, I found the text and the stone behind it, and it was bigger than the rumor ever let on. And the kings buried beneath that skyline didn't stay confined to their own kingdom for long. Some of them crossed the border north and put on Egypt's crown for themselves. Around 747 BC, a Kushite king named Pa marched his armies north out of Napata, moved through a fractured and divided Egypt, and did something no neighbor from the south had managed before. He took the throne of Egypt itself and made it his own. He wasn't the last. Historians now group Pa and the kings who followed him, Shabaka, Shabitku, Taharka, under a single name. The 25th dynasty, a line of Kushite pharaohs who ruled the full length of the Nile, from the deep south of Sudan to the Mediterranean coast, for very close to a century. As historians document it, this wasn't a raid or a brief occupation. It was a century of Kushite kings sitting on Egypt's throne, rebuilding its temples, restoring old religious practices to what they considered proper form, and ruling as pharaohs in every sense the word carried. The proof isn't a claim floating on its own. It's carved in granite and diorite you can walk up to in museums today. Statues of Taharka and his fellow Kushite pharaohs show them wearing the double uraeus, two rearing cobras on the crown instead of Egypt's usual single one, a small design detail scholars point to as a specific marker of Kushite royal identity, layered onto Egyptian tradition. Inscriptions at Gebel Barkal, at Kawa, at temples up and down the Nile record their names inside a pharaoh's cartouche. The same royal seal Egyptian rulers had used for 2,000 years before them. A civilization that supposedly couldn't write is somehow the same civilization whose kings left their names, their faces, and their victories carved into stone that's still standing 30 centuries later. A detail worth sitting with before we cross the Red Sea to a different empire entirely, one that would mint its wealth into coins stamped with its own king's faces. Cross the Red Sea from Kush's old territory, and you land in the highlands of what's now Ethiopia and Eritrea, where a kingdom called Aksum was already building something Kush never had reason to build, a trading empire with its own harbor. The port of Agilis sat on the coast like a doorway the whole ancient world used. ships arriving loaded with Roman glass and wine, Arabian spices, Indian cotton and pepper, and leaving again stacked with Axum's own ivory, gold, tortoise shell, and incense. This wasn't a kingdom trading at the edges of history. It was sitting at the center of a network, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and everyone who mattered in that network knew Axum's name. Most of what I learned growing up ranked the ancient world's great powers as Rome, Persia, maybe China if the lesson ran long, and stopped there. I've come to a different place on this one. As historians documented, a 3rd century Persian text, attributed to the prophet Mani, named only 4 kingdoms as the great powers of the world. Rome, Persia, China, and Axum, ranked right alongside them, not beneath them. That's not a modern reclamation project or a stretch of pride talking. That's a contemporary observer, writing at the time, placing an African kingdom in the same sentence as empires whose names still fill our textbooks today. Its port at Adulis connected it directly to Rome across the Mediterranean trade lanes, to the Arabian kingdoms across the narrow strip of the Red Sea, and to India across the open ocean beyond the Gulf of Aden. 3 separate trade worlds meeting in one African harbor. Axumite merchants weren't passive middlemen either. Records and finds along these routes show Axum actively shaping the terms of exchange, taxing what passed through, and building the kind of wealth that let its kings mint their own currency long before most of the ancient world attempted anything like it. A currency and an alphabet to go with it, that we're about to look at directly. Axum wrote in Diez, a script built for its own Semitic language family, cut into stone inscriptions, and eventually copied onto parchment for centuries of religious texts that followed. Unlike Meroitic across the Red Sea, Ge'ez didn't go silent. As historians documented, the Ge'ez language and alphabet are still in active liturgical use inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church today. Priests chanting from Ge'ez scripture in services held this very year, not just artifacts sealed behind museum glass. A writing system that's been continuously read and spoken for close to 2,000 years is not the mark of a civilization without letters. It's one of the longest unbroken literary traditions anywhere on Earth. Then there's the coinage, and this is the detail that tends to stop people cold. Beginning in the 3rd century AD, Axum's kings minted their own coins in gold, silver, and bronze. One of only a small handful of ancient states anywhere in the world to strike gold currency at all, alongside Rome and Persia. Archaeologists have found evidence that these coins carried the king's portrait, his name in Ge'ez script, and, on many of the gold issues, a small cross, marking a religious shift we'll get to shortly. Coins have turned up as far away as India and southern Arabia, physical proof that Axumite currency didn't just circulate at home. It traveled the same trade routes its ships did. Every one of those coins is a tiny written document, stamped and dated and signed by a king who wanted his name remembered. And thousands of them survived where more perishable records didn't. That's a currency system as advanced as anything Rome carried into its own marketplaces. Minted by a kingdom most classrooms never mention in the same conversation as Rome at all. And coinage was only the beginning of what Axum built in stone. Walk through the northern Ethiopian city of Axum today, and you'll find a field of stone giants rising out of the ground. Towering carved stelae, single blocks of granite cut to look like multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and false windows carved in relief, marking the graves of kings and nobles buried beneath them. The largest that ever stood, now broken across the ground where it fell centuries ago, would have measured over 30 meters tall, taller than a 10-story building, carved from one single piece of stone and dragged from a quarry several kilometers away without the wheel, without iron tools, stronger than what Axum's own smiths could forge by hand. Smaller stelae from the same field still stand upright today, and one of the largest, taken to Italy as a trophy under a different regime centuries later, was eventually returned and re-erected in Axum in 2005. A detail that tells you these stones were never fully forgotten, only misplaced. As historians document it, moving and raising a single block monument of that size required a level of engineering, leverage, ramps, rollers, coordinated labor on a scale that had to be organized and fed and housed for months. That few ancient societies anywhere attempted, let alone completed, successfully. Compare it to Rome's own obelisks. Most of them actually quarried in Egypt centuries earlier, and simply transported to Rome to be re-erected in public squares as trophies. Axum's largest stelae were quarried, carved, and raised entirely within its own territory, by its own engineers, taller in several cases than the very obelisks Rome imported and displayed as proof of conquest. That distinction, built here versus carried from elsewhere, is the kind of detail that rarely survives the trip into a textbook summary, even though it changes the whole comparison. I've been sitting with that comparison for a while now, because it flips something in my head every time I return to it. Rome took its tallest stone monuments from someone else's ground. Axum carved, transported, and stood its own, taller in places than what Rome carried home as spoils. I keep coming back to how rarely that side-by-side gets drawn in any classroom, and how much the picture changes once you actually draw it yourself. And the same kingdom that raised those stones was, within a generation or two, about to change its entire religious identity. As historians document it, sometime in the 4th century AD, most accounts place it in the reign of King Ezana, somewhere around 325 to 340. Axum's royal court converted to Christianity, guided by a shipwrecked Syrian named Frumentius, who rose to become the kingdom's first bishop. This makes Axum one of the earliest states anywhere in the world to adopt Christianity as an official religion, ahead of most of the Roman Empire itself, which wouldn't formally establish Christianity as its own state religion until decades later, under a different set of emperors entirely. The proof isn't only textual. Axumite coins minted after Ezana's reign swap out the older sun and crescent imagery for the Christian cross, a change you can hold in your hand and date almost to the decade. Rock-hewn and freestanding churches across the highlands, some, like the monastery at Debra-Damo, cut directly into cliff faces reachable only by rope, carry architectural styles scholars trace directly back to Axumite building traditions, still in continuous religious use by the same church community, generation after generation into the present day. Manuscripts kept inside those same churches, written in the GE script we already traced back to Axum's coins and inscriptions, preserve liturgy, history, and royal chronicle side by side, treating the written word as something sacred enough to protect for 15 centuries, and counting. A kingdom that minted its own gold, carved stone taller than Rome's imported trophies, and turned Christian a full generation ahead of the empire that gets the credit for spreading the faith. That's Axum's record, sitting quietly in plain sight while the textbooks moved on to talk about someone else entirely. And west across the continent, in the centuries after Axum's peak, a very different kind of wealth was about to make one king's name the most famous fortune in medieval history. In 1324, that different kind of wealth walked out of a West African capital and started north, across nearly 3,000 miles of open desert, on its way to Mecca. The king leading it was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, and the caravan behind him stretched for miles. Camels loaded with gold dust, soldiers dressed in bright cloth, servants carrying rods of solid gold, and by some counts, as many as 60,000 people walking together toward the holiest city in Islam. This was not a king slipping quietly out of his own borders. This was a procession built to be seen, remembered, and written down by everyone it passed. As historians documented, the caravan's route ran straight through Cairo, and it stayed there long enough to change the local economy. Chroniclers writing decades later still described how Mansa Musa gave away so much gold in the markets of Cairo, buying goods, settling debts, handing gifts to scholars and officials, that the price of gold in Egypt reportedly dropped and took years to fully recover. That gold came from somewhere specific. Gold trade routes across the Sahara, that had carried West African gold north for centuries, moving hand to hand between Saharan salt merchants and Sahelian gold traders until it reached Mediterranean ports, and, from there, the rest of the medieval world. How much was Mansa Musa actually worth? That's one of the estimates historians still debate, and the honest answer is, nobody can give you an exact number. Records simply weren't kept that way in the 14th century. Some modern estimates have called him the wealthiest individual in recorded history, measured against the gold he controlled and the scale of Mali's mines. Other historians push back on any single dollar figure, arguing it flattens something too vast to convert cleanly into modern currency. I remember the first time I read the Cairo chronicler's account of that gold collapse, a whole regional economy bent by one man's passing generosity. And I sat with it a long time, because that's not a legend. That's an economic record, written down by people who watched it happen. And that gold, as staggering as it was, wasn't even the part of Mali's legacy that mattered most to the people who lived there. Because while the gold moved north to Mecca, something else was quietly rising back home in Timbuktu, a city built not only around a treasury, but around a library. At the heart of it stood Sankor, a center of learning attached to a mosque that had been teaching scholars since long before Mansa Musa's reign, and that would keep teaching them for centuries after. Sankor functioned as something close to a university district. Students came to study law, theology, mathematics, and astronomy, moving between teachers who each specialized in a different discipline, much the way a student today moves between departments on a campus. As historians document it, the manuscripts produced and collected in Timbuktu over those centuries now number in the tens of thousands. Some broader regional estimates run well past 100,000 across the wider Sahel, most of them written in Arabic script by West African hands, covering subjects far beyond religion alone. Scholars traveled from as far as Cairo, Fez, and Mecca to study at Sankor, and the reverse held true as well. Timbuktu's own scholars traveled outward, carrying its reputation for learning into the wider Islamic world. At a time when few accounts of West Africa circulating in Europe assumed anything of the kind. Picture a library built from mud brick and cedar beams, its shelves holding manuscripts wrapped in leather, some water-stained and centuries old, still legible today because families protected them for generations, hiding them in trunks and false ceilings whenever war or looting threatened the city. That's not folklore. That's a documented archive, one that modern conservators are still cataloging page by page. A king who could give away gold like sand in the streets of Cairo, and a city that valued its books enough to bury them rather than lose them. That's the fuller shape of Mali most textbooks never got around to drawing. And that same city held onto a written tradition that went far beyond religious study alone. That written tradition covered far more ground than most people assume when they picture a religious library. Alongside Quranic commentary and Islamic law, Sankore's scholars and the wider network of scribes across Mali produced manuscripts on medicine, treatises describing herbal remedies, surgical techniques and case notes from working physicians, and on astronomy, tracking star movements and calendar calculations that West African scholars used for both religious observance and agricultural planning. Some of these pages still carry the name of the physician or astronomer who wrote them in the margin, a detail that turns an abstract documented archive into a working record of real people practicing real professions, centuries before anyone in Europe assumed West Africa had professions like these at all. As historians documented, the legal manuscripts alone form one of the richest bodies of Arabic script scholarship anywhere in West Africa. Recorded court rulings, contracts, marriage records, and scholarly legal opinions written by local judges settling real disputes between real people, not copied down from some distant capital. Many of these documents survived, not in a single royal collection, but scattered across private family libraries, passed down as inheritance from one generation of scholars to the next, kept in wooden chests in ordinary homes across Timbuktu and Djenné, some families guarding the same manuscripts for 400 and 500 years. Ahmad Baba al-Masufi, one of Timbuktu's most cited scholars, is recorded by chroniclers as owning a personal library of some 1,600 volumes. And by his own account, that made his collection one of the more modest private libraries in the city, not the largest. I'll admit, the first time I understood that these were private family libraries, not one grand state archive, but thousands of households each holding a piece of the same tradition, it reframed the whole picture for me. This wasn't scholarship handed down from above. It was a culture of literacy, woven into ordinary households, generation after generation, in medicine, law, and the stars. And once you've counted what these families protected on their own shelves, the next question almost asks itself, how big was the empire that made room for all of it? As historians document it, Mali, at its height under Mansa Musa's line, stretched across a territory some estimates place at well over 400,000 square miles, spanning from the Atlantic coast inland across the Niger Bend, encompassing dozens of smaller kingdoms and trading cities under a single administrative umbrella. The empire ran on a provincial administrative structure, with governors appointed to oversee regional centers, taxes routed back through a structured hierarchy, and trade regulated along routes connecting the gold fields of the south to the salt mines of the Sahara and onward to Mediterranean ports. Provincial governors answered to a central court. Judges were appointed separately from political administrators to hear disputes under religious law, and tax officials tracked caravans of salt, gold, and copper as they crossed from one province into the next. A layered system historians describe as notably organized for its era, not an improvised patchwork. Set that beside Rome at its own territorial peak, and you're not comparing a village kingdom to an empire. You're comparing two empires, each running provinces, taxation, and trade across a continent's worth of distance. Between you and me, I think that's exactly why this comparison rarely shows up in a classroom. Once you put Mali's administrative reach next to Rome's, the old textbook line about no African empire matching Rome stops holding up. Mali's trade wealth, spread across gold, salt, copper, and textiles, stood alongside the treasuries of its Mediterranean and Middle Eastern contemporaries. Venetian and Genoese ledgers from the same century record gold, arriving from West African sources without always naming the empire behind it. A gap in European bookkeeping, not evidence the wealth wasn't there. Mali's own written record backs that up, not just its legend. But even an empire that size couldn't hold the title forever. Within a century, a new power rising along the Niger was about to surpass it. That power was Songhai, and by the late 15th century, under rulers like Sunni Ali and later Askia Muhammad, it had absorbed Mali's old territory and pushed the borders even further along the Niger River, controlling a stretch of West Africa that, as historians documented, ran even larger than Mali's own peak, reaching from the Atlantic-facing Sahel deep into the Sahara's trading towns. Sunni Ali's campaigns brought river ports and desert trade towns under one command in a matter of decades, and Askia Muhammad, the general who succeeded him, is credited by many historians with turning that conquest into something built to last past his own lifetime. Songhai ran on a provincial administrative system more elaborate than the one it inherited. Regional governors, a standing professional army, rather than tribal levies alone, tax officials assigned to specific provinces, and a treasury structured to draw revenue from trade all along the river. Gao, the imperial capital, and Timbuktu, still the empire's intellectual center, functioned as twin hearts of the same body, one holding the throne and the military command, the other holding the libraries, the judges, and the university scholars, each city feeding the other's authority. Askia Muhammad went further still, many historians note, appointing separate ministers over finance, justice, and the navy that patrolled the Niger itself, a division of government roles specific enough that some scholars compare it directly to the administrative offices of contemporary states in North Africa and the Middle East. Many historians point to Askia Muhammad's own pilgrimage to Mecca, a procession that, like Mansa Musa's before him, carried enough gold to draw the attention of Cairo's chroniclers all over again. as proof this wasn't a fading kingdom playing at the memory of Mali's glory. It was a functioning, taxed, administered empire running its own systems at a scale historians now place among the largest West Africa ever produced. And while Songhai's armies and scholars held the Niger, several thousand miles south and east, another civilization was raising stone walls that would outlast every empire on this list. In the highlands of what is now Zimbabwe, between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries, builders raised a city out of granite blocks, stacked without a single drop of mortar holding them together. A construction technique called dry stone walling, where each stone is cut and fitted precisely enough that its own weight and friction keep the wall standing. Builders selected granite that naturally splits into even slabs when heated and cooled, then dressed each block by hand until it locked against its neighbors, a method requiring exact judgment of stone, weight, and angle rather than any binding agent at all. Archaeologists have found evidence that the site's outer wall, known as the Great Enclosure, rises over 30 feet in places and runs some 800 feet in circumference, using an estimated 1 million granite blocks, each shaped by hand from stone quarried nearby and carried into place without cranes, without cement, and without a single written blueprint that has survived to explain the plan behind it. The wider settlement covered close to 1,800 acres at its height, making it one of the largest stone structures anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa before the colonial period. Home to what many archaeologists estimate was a population in the tens of thousands. A tapering conical stone tower stands inside the great enclosure itself, its function still debated among archaeologists. Some read it as a grain storage symbol tied to royal authority, others as a marker of chiefly power, but its construction, solid stone rather than hollow, required the same exacting technique as the outer walls around it. I've been sitting with the fact that these walls have stood, unreinforced, through roughly 8 centuries of rain, wind, and shifting ground. Longer than most concrete structures built with modern engineering are expected to last. Excavations show centuries of continuous occupation across that span. Layers of pottery, ironwork, and imported goods stacked, one on top of the other, generation after generation, without ever needing an outside power to rebuild what its own people had already built to last. Great Zimbabwe's walls are not a ruin someone stumbled onto by accident. They are still standing today, in a shape any visitor can walk through and touch, more durable proof than most of what survives from ancient Rome itself. And those same walls stood at the center of trade routes that reached farther than most people ever imagine. Those same walls stood at the center of trade routes that reached farther than most people ever imagine. Great Zimbabwe sat inland, days from open water, and yet caravans carried its gold and ivory east, across savanna and scrubland, until the ground gave way to the Indian Ocean coast. Archaeologists have found evidence that this inland kingdom fed a coastal trading system stretching from the Zambezi mouth up toward the Swahili towns of Kilwa and Sofala, where Bantu-speaking traders, Arab merchants, and Persian sailors had already been doing business for centuries before any European ship charted these waters. Gold panned from Zimbabwean rivers and ivory carved from elephants hunted deep in the interior moved hand to hand along this route, port to port, until it reached markets that had never heard the word Rome. Kilwa and Sofala were not backwater outposts waiting for history to notice them. Many historians describe Kilwa in particular as one of the wealthiest port cities on the entire Indian Ocean rim by the 14th century. Its stone mosques and merchant houses, built from coral rag quarried straight out of the reef. These Swahili coast cities functioned as the hinge between Great Zimbabwe's gold fields and a trading world that stretched to Arabia, to the Persian Gulf, and on to the western coast of India. Dhows loaded with African gold and ivory left these harbors bound east, and dhows loaded with glass beads, cloth, and ceramics came back the other way, season after season, tide after tide. Here is the detail that still stops me. Archaeologists have found evidence that includes shards of Chinese porcelain, Persian glazed pottery, and glass beads from as far as India, all sitting in the same soil as locally forged iron tools at Great Zimbabwe. A study tracing some of that porcelain back to Chinese kilns, active during the Ming Dynasty, suggests it crossed the Indian Ocean over centuries of relay trade, rather than any single direct voyage. An inland stone city, roughly 200 miles from the nearest coastline, was somehow receiving goods manufactured on the other side of the world. That is not folklore passed down at a fireside. That is broken pottery you can hold in your hand today. Put these numbers next to Rome, and the comparison gets uncomfortable fast. Not because one side wins outright, but because historians rarely even attempt the comparison. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled territory across 3 continents and lasted, as an organized state, for roughly 5 centuries before its western half collapsed. Songhai, at its peak under Askia Muhammad, is estimated by many historians to have governed territory rivaling Rome's in raw square mileage, even if it held that scale for a shorter stretch, closer to a century of dominant reach before succession disputes, and later, Moroccan invasion broke it apart. Great Zimbabwe's political reach over the surrounding region is harder to measure precisely, historians note, but the city itself stood inhabited and functioning for close to 4 centuries, longer than Rome held its western provinces intact. Most of what I was taught treated empire like a single scoreboard. Legions, roads, an emperor's face stamped on a coin, and measured everything else against that one template. I've come to think that's the wrong yardstick entirely. Rome is remembered for its durability and its bureaucracy. Axum, as we've already seen, minted its own currency for longer than most people realize. Songhai ran provinces with that same administrative precision. Great Zimbabwe simply outlasted the need for conquest altogether, standing on trade and stone, rather than standing armies. None of that diminishes what Rome built. It just means Rome was never the only empire worth studying, and for a long stretch of the history most of us learned, it was treated as if it were. Kush, Axum, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe were each measured on their own terms, by their own peoples, long before anyone outside those borders thought to compare them to anything at all. So if Kush built pyramids, if Axum minted coins before most of Europe had a functioning currency, if Songhai ran provinces, and Great Zimbabwe raised stone cities that still stand, why did none of this make it into your textbook? As historians document it, part of the answer traces back to how school curricula took shape during the colonial period itself, when the same European powers governing large parts of Africa also controlled much of what got written about it. World history courses developed in Britain, France, and the United States through the late 19th and early 20th centuries treated European history as the default narrative, the trunk of the tree, with everywhere else reduced to a branch worth a paragraph, if that. One line from this era still gets quoted by historians today, usually as a cautionary example rather than a compliment. Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper, in a 1963 lecture, said there was only the history of the Europeans in Africa, calling the rest largely darkness. If I'm being honest, the first time I read that quote, I had to put the book down for a minute, not because it was unusual for its time. Many scholars now note it was disturbingly typical of the academic mainstream in that era, but because a line like that, coming from a respected chair at a major university, shaped what an entire generation of students believed was worth teaching in the first place. Kush, Axum, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, kingdoms with written records, minted coinage, and standing architecture rarely made it past a footnote in curricula built on that assumption. Many historians now point out this wasn't really an accident of ignorance. The primary sources existed. The inscriptions were still standing in the ground. What was missing was the will to build a curriculum around them, because the working premise going in was that Africa's story began the day Europeans arrived to write it down. That premise shaped textbooks for generations, and honestly, it shaped a large part of what most of us grew up believing without ever thinking to question it. The textbooks themselves tell part of this story just by how they were built. Many general world history surveys published in Britain and the United States through the mid-20th century, historians note, devoted a page or two to the entire African continent, usually folded into a chapter on the Atlantic slave trade or European exploration, rather than given a timeline of its own. Publishers were responding to what curriculum boards asked for, and curriculum boards were responding to what the leading academic departments of the time considered central history. Each link in that chain reinforced the one before it, and Africa's kingdoms kept landing outside the frame, call after call, edition after edition. Compounding the problem, historians point out, was translation. Thousands of manuscripts from Timbuktu's libraries were written in Arabic, many by African scholars documenting law, medicine, and astronomy. And for most of the 20th century, only a small fraction of them had been translated into English or French. The Meroitic script from Kush, as we covered earlier, remains only partially deciphered even now. A source scholars cannot yet read is a source that cannot easily reach a classroom. That is a real barrier, not an excuse. But it explains, historians argue, why even well-intentioned textbook writers often had limited material available to draw from at all. Serious academic attention to African history as its own field of study, many historians agree, did not gain real institutional traction until well into the 20th century. UNESCO's General History of Africa project, launched in the 1960s, and drawing on scholars like Basil Davidson, was one of the first large coordinated efforts to compile this history from African-authored sources and archaeological fieldwork, rather than second-hand colonial accounts. It took decades just to publish. By the time much of it reached English-language classrooms, generations of students, in one form or another, had already finished school having heard almost none of it. Here's something worth sitting with, just between us for a second. Even when older textbooks did mention Africa, historians note, the story usually arrived through a single lens, the transatlantic slave trade, presented as if it were the whole of the continent's history, rather than one devastating chapter within a much longer, much wider, civilizational record. That framing wasn't necessarily designed to leave everything else out, but the effect landed the same way regardless of intent. If the only story you're told about a place is its worst chapter, you walk away assuming that chapter is the entire book. Picture the actual shelf of material historians work with. Royal chronicles from Mali written in Arabic script, temple inscriptions from Kush carved in stone, coin legends from Axum stamped in Ge'ez, oral genealogies preserved by professional memory keepers across West Africa for centuries. Many historians argue that reducing all of that to a handful of paragraphs about capture and sale isn't just incomplete, it inverts the actual proportion of the record. The slave trade is real, documented, and devastating, and it deserves its full weight in any honest telling. But it was never the only chapter these kingdoms wrote for themselves, and it was rarely taught alongside the rest of what they built. If you're still with me here, this is the part I need you to really hear. You were handed one chapter and told it was the whole book. Somewhere between the pyramids of Meroe and the libraries of Timbuktu, an entire library's worth of chapters went missing from the reading list. That's not a small correction. That's the difference between inheriting a single wound and inheriting a full civilization. Coins, courts, cities, and all. Both things are true about this history. Only one of them made it into most classrooms. None of this record actually vanished, though, and that might be the most encouraging part of this whole chapter. Tens of thousands of manuscripts from Timbuktu's private and institutional libraries survived centuries of dust, sand, and neglect. Many preserved by families who hid and protected them long before any outside archive took an interest. Stone inscriptions from Kush and Axum have stood in the open for close to 2,000 years, weathering wind and rain rather than disappearing from some bookshelf. Historians document that far more of this civilizational record survived than most people were ever taught to expect. Alongside the written record runs a parallel one carried by voice rather than ink. West African griot traditions, preserved royal genealogies, court histories, and epic narratives like the Sundiata epic across generations. Memorized word for word and passed from master to apprentice as a formal profession. not casual storytelling. Many historians now treat griot oral history as a legitimate primary source in its own right, cross-checking it against Arabic chronicles and archaeological finds, and finding the two records line up more often than early skeptics assumed they would. A voice trained for decades to remember precisely is its own kind of archive. Modern archaeology keeps closing the gap between what was written down and what can be dug up and verified. Excavations at Great Zimbabwe, at Axum's Stellai Field, and along Kush's pyramid sites have confirmed, historians report, details that inscriptions and oral accounts had claimed all along, long before anyone thought to doubt them. Every dig that lines up with the old record makes the case a little harder to wave away. The history was not lost. It was left out of the books people were handed, which is a very different problem, and a fixable one. The books were left out. The bones and the blood were not. That's where this chapter starts. And it starts in a place no history teacher ever sent you. A genetics lab. Years after the last king of these kingdoms died. Running samples through machines that don't care what any textbook decided to leave in or leave out. A population genetics study found something that no manuscript alone could have told us. A measurable, traceable thread of ancestry running from the Nile Valley and the Sahel straight into millions of people living today, most of whom never read a single page about Kush or Mali in school. Here's how the method actually works, because I think it matters that you understand it, and not just take my word for it. Researchers compared DNA drawn from skeletal remains at archaeological sites, Kushite tombs near the Nile's Fourth Cataract, Axumite burial grounds carved into highland rock, the stone terraces of Great Zimbabwe, against genetic databases built from living populations across West Africa, East Africa, and the wider diaspora. They trace specific markers, mitochondrial lines passed mother to daughter, and Y chromosome lines passed father to son, unbroken for thousands of years, the same way a family name gets passed from grandfather to grandson. When those markers line up between an ancient skeleton and a living person's genome, historians and geneticists together call that a documented lineage, not a guess dressed up in fancy language. It is slower than reading an inscription. It is also much harder to argue with, and the communities on the receiving end of that lineage are not abstractions. Genetic ancestry projects working with descendant communities in Sudan, Mali, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe have connected present-day families to burial populations going back over 1,000 years, and diaspora ancestry testing has traced comparable markers into Black communities across the Americas and the Caribbean. Many geneticists now treat this as one of the more reliable bridges between ancient civilization and living family. Reliable enough that it gets cited in peer-reviewed journals, not just cited in speeches. This is not a claim about any one bloodline being purer or more chosen than another. It is a documented, traceable connection, the kind that shows up the same way whether or not anyone believes it. Somewhere in that data is the reason your grandmother's face reminded someone of a temple carving. That is not sentiment. That is a chain of evidence, link by link. Now hold all 5 of these kingdoms in your mind at once, because this is where the individual chapters start to become one story. Kush along the Nile, Axum along the Red Sea, Mali and Songhai across the Sahel, Great Zimbabwe on the southern plateau. 5 different regions, 5 different centuries at their peak, 5 different languages carved into 5 different kinds of stone. And yet historians studying them side by side keep landing on the same 3 things, again and again. A writing system built and used by its own people. A scale of wealth and territory that rivaled the empires Western textbooks were built around, and trade networks stretching for thousands of miles in every direction, carrying gold, salt, ivory, and manuscripts along routes that connected one kingdom to the next long before any European map recorded them. I've been sitting with that overlap for a long time, honestly, because at first, it looks like coincidence. 5 kingdoms, thousands of miles apart, developing writing, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade on their own timelines, none of them copying the other's homework. But the more you lay the evidence side by side, Meroitic inscriptions next to Jez coin legends, Timbuktu's manuscripts next to Great Zimbabwe's stone walls, the harder it gets to file this under coincidence. This is not one gifted king, or one lucky river valley. It is a pattern historians increasingly describe as consensus, not speculation. An entire continent building sophisticated, literate, wealthy civilizations on its own terms, in parallel, while a handful of chapters in an old textbook told you it never happened at all. My elders told me a version of this growing up, in pieces, without footnotes. Years later, sitting with these 5 kingdoms side by side, I finally found the documented record, underneath what I'd only ever heard as family story. Stay with me here, because everything we've laid out, the scripts, the pyramids, the coinage, the stone cities, was always building toward one place. The genetics we just walked through is not a footnote to that pattern. It is the hinge. It is the piece that takes 5 ancient kingdoms and turns them into your own family tree. And that is exactly where we're going next. So what do you actually do with all of this once the credits could roll? Not pride without a floor under it. That's the trap a lot of this kind of content falls into. And I want to name it plainly before we go any further. What we've built across this hour is identity reclaimed through evidence, not assertion. You don't have to take my word for any of it. And honestly, I'd rather you didn't. Historians and archaeologists have done the slow, unglamorous work of pulling this record out of the ground and off the page. And that work is what I'm handing you now, not a slogan dressed up as history. Here are the facts, stacked plainly, the kind you can repeat in a real conversation without flinching. A Meroitic script, still being partially deciphered by linguists today. More pyramids standing at Meroe than historians count at Giza. A 25th dynasty of pharaohs, who ruled Egypt from Nubia, their faces preserved in stone statuary that still stands. Axum minting its own gold coinage, while Rome was still expanding into Gaul. Mali's Sankor holding tens of thousands of manuscripts on law, medicine, and the stars. Great Zimbabwe's dry stone walls standing mortar-free for 8 centuries. And now, layered on top of all of it, a documented genetic thread that researchers trace from these very kingdoms into present-day families. That is not a t-shirt slogan. That is a citation list you can hand to anyone who doubts you, footnote by footnote, kingdom by kingdom. I've watched people try to win this argument with volume instead of sources, and it never lands the same way as just naming the evidence, calmly, one piece at a time. That's the approach I've come to trust more than any other, and it's the one I've tried to hold to for this entire hour. And here, finally, is the discovery I promised you at the very start, the one I told you not to expect until the end. Do you remember that scribe in Meroe, pressing a reed pen into wet clay, recording his king's war in a language your history class told you never existed? Historians studying that same Meroitic record read alongside the lineage tracing genetic study we just walked through. Describe a documented line connecting that throne room to living descendants today. Not a metaphor, and not a devotional flourish, but a chain of evidence that historians and geneticists both stand behind, even while continuing to debate its finer details. I told you at the start that it would only get stronger as we went, not weaker, and I meant it. Of everything in this entire hour, the scripts, the coinage, the stone walls, this is the piece I keep coming back to. A study found a traceable genetic connection between an ancient Nubian population and communities living now. And when you set that next to a written record stretching back 3,000 years, the two together make a case far harder to set aside than either one alone. If I'm honest, the first time I sat with that finding, I had to close my notes for a minute and just let it settle. I've read enough of these studies over the years to know that historians and geneticists rarely agree on everything. And this pattern is no different. Some argue over exact dates, some over sample sizes, some over how far back a marker can reliably be traced. What they tend not to argue about is the underlying thread itself. Something documented connects that Nubian throne room to families living now, and no single old textbook chapter ever accounted for that. So let me speak to you directly for a moment, because that is really what this whole hour has been about. Somewhere between Kush and Axum, between Mali and Great Zimbabwe, this stopped being a story about other people and became a story that reaches towards you. If you grew up hearing pieces of this, a grandmother's phrase, a preacher's aside, a name mentioned once and never explained, the record we've walked through tonight stands behind what you were only ever given in fragments. The kingdoms did not simply rise once and disappear into a footnote. They left writing, coinage, architecture, and for those of us willing to sit with the genetic record, a traceable thread historians can follow into the present day, possibly into the very room you're sitting in right now. I don't offer that as a burden, and I don't offer it as a slogan. I offer it as a documented possibility worth carrying the way you'd carry any fact worth knowing about your own family. So here is where this hour lands, and I want you to hear this part slowly. You did not just watch a documentary about 5 kingdoms that happened to exist a long time ago. If any part of Kush, Axum, Mali, Songhai, or Great Zimbabwe traces into your own family line, you are not adopting a heritage tonight. You are reclaiming one that was always yours, one that a handful of textbook chapters simply never handed back to you. Every script, every coin, every stone wall we walked through tonight was already yours before this video started. This hour just handed you the paperwork. I've been sitting with what that actually means for a while now, and where I keep landing is this. Reclaiming it is not the finish line. It's the starting one. My grandmother used to say we came from somewhere she couldn't fully name. And for years that was all I had. A feeling, not a footnote. It took me a long time, and a lot of reading, to find the documented record standing behind what she only ever said in passing. Because a legacy like this comes with a job attached, and I won't pretend otherwise. Somebody has to be the one who says the name of Pa, the Nubian pharaoh, out loud to a nephew who's never heard it. Somebody has to be the one who mentions Senghor's library the next time a classroom reduces an entire continent to 3 sentences. That responsibility does not fall on historians alone. It falls on whoever just spent an hour learning these names and finding out they were theirs all along. Passing this forward is not extra credit. It's the actual assignment. Now, before we close, I need something from you, and it's a real ask, not a formality tacked onto the end of a video. What stood out most to you tonight? Kush's script, Axum's coins, Mali's library, Great Zimbabwe's walls, or the genetic thread tying it all together? Drop that in the comments. Tell me which kingdom you'd never heard of before this hour. Because I read every one of those, and I build future chapters around what you tell me you didn't know. And if this hour gave you even one fact you didn't have this morning, share it with one person who's still carrying around the version of this history that got left out of the books. One person. Someone who was told the same 3 myths you were told. You don't have to convince them of everything tonight. You just have to hand them the door and let them decide whether to walk through it. The same way this video handed it to you. Now, a word of honesty before we close, because I think it matters as much as anything else I've said tonight. Everything you just heard is one careful reading of this record. Mine, built from manuscripts, inscriptions, and studies I've laid out across this hour. Every one of them verifiable in the citations above. Historians have spent lifetimes on Kush, Axum, Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe. And they don't agree on every date or every number I've used tonight. That disagreement is not a weakness in the record. It's an invitation. Go study the primary sources yourself. Read the inscriptions, read the manuscripts, sit with the genetic studies the way I have, and see where your own reading lands. I'd rather send you toward the evidence than ask you to simply trust my version of it. And now, before you go, let me pray something over this hour and over you. To whoever is listening, whatever your background, whatever kingdom your own family line runs through or doesn't, I believe every soul watching this was made by the same hand, and this history belongs to the wider human record, even as it speaks specifically to some of us tonight. I pray for clearer eyes for anyone still holding the version of history that left entire continents out of the telling. I pray for the researchers still digging, still translating, still deciphering scripts nobody's fully cracked yet. In Mero and in Great Zimbabwe, and in every archive still waiting for someone patient enough to read it properly. And I pray for you, specifically whoever you are and wherever you're watching this from, that whatever you carry forward from this hour, you carry it steady, and that it makes you gentler with the history of others, even as it roots you deeper in your own. Walk remembered. Walk forward. That's the line I want you to leave with tonight. If this hour meant something to you, subscribe, because there's another kingdom, another discovery, another chapter of this record, waiting for next time. Until then, walk remembered, and walk forward.